3 times. That's how many times I found that trailer sitting on my land before I finally realized I wasn't dealing with a misunderstanding anymore. The first time, I figured maybe somebody got confused. The second time, I gave them the benefit of the doubt. But when I drove by and saw that thing parked there again, 10 feet away from a private property sign that practically screamed at you in red letters, that's when it hit me. Some people don't mistake kindness for kindness. They mistake it for weakness. And the funny thing is, the guy who owned that trailer was sleeping comfortably 3 houses away, completely convinced nobody would ever actually do anything about it. My name's Ethan Mercer, and this whole mess started because of a piece of land most people would have forgotten they even owned. About 16 years ago, I bought a half-acre gravel lot outside a little place called Pine Hollow, Wisconsin. Nothing special, really. Just a quiet patch of land where Willow Creek Road curved toward the lake, surrounded by cedar trees, wild grass, and enough peace and quiet to make you forget what day of the week it was. Back then, my brother Scott thought I was nuts. He stood there one afternoon with his hands in his pockets and said, "You're seriously spending money on dirt?" I laughed and told him, "You never know. Maybe one day I'll build something." Truth was, I had no plans. I just liked the place. Sometimes life doesn't need a grand strategy. Sometimes you just hang on to things because they feel right. And for over a decade, that little lot sat there untouched. No problems, no drama, just gravel, trees, and the occasional deer acting like they owned the place. Which, honestly, they kind of did. Then a guy named Garrett Hensley moved into the neighborhood. Garrett lived down by the lake in one of those oversized houses people buy after watching too many home renovation shows. Mid-40s, loud laugh, expensive sunglasses, shiny black pickup truck that always looked cleaner than mine. He wasn't unfriendly exactly. Just one of those guys who walked around with the confidence of somebody who'd never been told no very often. We weren't close, just neighborhood wave acquaintances. Until one Friday evening in July when I spotted a giant white travel trailer sitting on my property. At first, I almost drove past without thinking much about it. People pull over all the time. Fishermen, tourists, somebody checking directions. But as I slowed down, my stomach tightened. The tires weren't on the shoulder. They weren't near the ditch. They were sitting squarely on my gravel. Not in the middle, but definitely inside the property stakes. I parked and walked over. 40 feet of trailer. Fancy windows. Slide-outs. The kind of thing that costs more than some houses. I stood there listening to the wind through the trees and told myself not to overreact. Maybe somebody would move it in an hour. Maybe I was making a big deal out of nothing. But the next Friday came, and that same trailer was sitting there again, looking like it paid taxes on the place. That's when irritation started replacing patience. And I already had a pretty good idea whose trailer it was. I'd seen Garrett towing something nearly identical toward the lake plenty of times. So I walked down to his house. He happened to be outside with a beer in his hand, leaning against his truck while some country song played quietly from the garage. "Evening," I said. He nodded. "Hey, Ethan." I pointed back toward the road. "Quick question. That big white trailer on the corner lot, yours?" He barely looked up. "Yeah. What?" And right there, before he'd even finished the sentence, something in his tone told me he already knew exactly where this conversation was headed. I kept things polite. "Well, that corner lot belongs to me, and your trailer's parked on it." Garrett took a slow sip of his beer and shrugged like I was telling him it might rain tomorrow. "It's just gravel, man." I blinked. I actually thought I'd misheard him. "Yeah," I said slowly, "but it's my gravel." He chuckled. "My driveway's too tight. Thing barely fits over there. Figure nobody was using that lot anyway." I remember hearing cicadas, buzzing, and thinking how ridiculous the whole conversation felt. I wasn't asking for money. I wasn't threatening anybody. I just wanted my property respected. So I kept my voice calm. "I'd appreciate it if you moved it." Garrett tipped the beer, contoured me like we were closing a business deal. "Sure, no problem." The next morning, the trailer was gone. And honestly, I thought that was the end of it. But 7 days later, just before sunset, I turned onto Willow Creek Road, and there it was again, same trailer, same spot, like we'd never had that conversation at all. And sitting there behind the wheel of my truck, engine idling while the evening sun hit those white panels, I suddenly remembered something my grandfather used to tell me when I was a kid. He'd say, "Son, some folks don't hear words. They hear consequences." And as I sat there staring at that trailer, I had a feeling Garrett Hensley was about to learn exactly what Grandpa meant. Now, I could have marched right back over to Garrett's house and had the exact same conversation all over again, but something about the way he'd shrugged and said, "It's just gravel," kept replaying in my head. It wasn't anger that bothered me. Honestly, it was the entitlement. It was that strange confidence some people have when they've convinced themselves everybody else's boundaries are optional. So instead of knocking on his door again, I drove home, poured myself a cup of coffee, sat down at the kitchen table, and opened my laptop. My late grandfather used to say that arguing with stubborn people is like trying to wrestle a pig. Eventually, you realize the pig enjoys it. So I decided I wasn't going to wrestle anybody. I was going to do something much simpler. I was going to follow the rules. Pine Hollow sat inside Ashford County, and after about an hour of reading local ordinances, I found exactly what I was looking for. Turns out the county had very clear laws regarding unauthorized vehicles on private property. If warning signs were visible and the proper towing agreement was on file, property owners had every right to remove vehicles parked without permission. No shouting, no confrontation, no police standing there playing referee. Just paperwork and a phone call. I leaned back in my chair and laughed to myself because suddenly the whole thing stopped feeling frustrating. It felt solvable. The next morning, I drove out to the lot with a tape measure and a notepad. If I was going to do this, I was doing it correctly. There were two obvious entry points onto the property. One from the shoulder, another where the gravel widened near the tree line. Coincidentally, exactly where Garrett kept backing his trailer. I sketched everything out and drove into town. Old Charlie Dawson still ran Dawson Hardware, the kind of place where the floors creak and everybody knows your dog's name. Charlie looked up when I walked in. "Morning, Ethan. What brings you in?" "Need a couple reflective signs," I said. "The towing kind." His eyebrows went up. "Somebody causing trouble?" I shrugged. "Depends who you ask." 20 minutes later, I walked out carrying two bright red signs that read private property. Unauthorized vehicles will be towed at owner's expense. The next step was finding somebody willing to do the towing. There was only one company in the county that handled heavy equipment and RVs, Ridgeway Recovery. I gave them a call. A deep voice answered, "Ridgeway Recovery. Hi, my name's Ethan Mercer. I've got some private property, and I'd like to set up an enforcement agreement." There was a brief pause. Then the man chuckled. "Unauthorized parking. Exactly. Happens more than you'd think." His name was Wade Collins. Big guy, according to everybody who knew him. Former Marine. Beard like a lumberjack. Friendly, but no nonsense. He explained the process. They filed the paperwork with the sheriff's office. I'd put their company information on the signs, and if anybody parked illegally, one phone call was all it'd take. I asked him, "What does it usually cost somebody?" Wade laughed. "Depends on what we're dragging away. But if you're talking about one of those big campers," he whistled. "Let's just say people remember the bill." By Monday, everything was official. I installed the signs myself. One near the road, one right beside the entrance Garrett liked using. I even put up a chain barrier between two steel posts. Nothing fancy, just enough to make it obvious this wasn't public land. And then, nothing happened. For almost 5 weeks. No trailer. No problems. Every time I drove by, the lot looked peaceful again. The signs reflected sunlight during the day, and the breeze rustled through the cedars exactly the way it had for years. Part of me thought maybe Garrett had finally gotten the message. Another part wondered if I'd overreacted. Maybe he'd found somewhere else. Maybe people deserved the benefit of the doubt. Life moved on. Summer slowly turned into early fall. The evenings got cooler. Leaves started showing little hints of orange. Football season rolled around, and honestly, the whole thing slipped to the back of my mind. Until one Friday night in September. I got off work late. The sun had already disappeared behind the hills when I turned onto Willow Creek Road. My headlights swept across the corner lot, and I hit the brakes. There was that trailer. Garrett's trailer. But this time, he wasn't even pretending anymore. The thing sat right in the middle of the gravel. And what almost made me laugh out loud was the fact that it was parked maybe 10 feet away from the giant red warning sign. Like he either hadn't seen it or believed nobody would actually enforce it. I pulled over and just stared. Most people probably imagine I was furious. Truth is, I wasn't. I felt calm, because at that moment, I knew something Garrett didn't. The hard part was already done. Everything had been arranged weeks earlier. I walked across the gravel, checked the license plate, looked at the sign one more time to make sure it was clearly visible, then pulled out my phone and called the number printed at the bottom. Wade answered on the second ring. Ridgeway Recovery. Hey, Wade. Ethan Mercer. Got one. I looked back at the trailer sitting peacefully under the moonlight. 40-footer. Right inside the property line. Wade laughed softly. Now that's expensive. How long? I asked. 45 minutes. I hung up and leaned against my truck. The road was quiet. Wind moved through the trees. Somewhere off in the distance, a dog barked. And I remember wondering if Garrett was sitting in his living room watching television, completely unaware that his very expensive trailer was about to begin a journey he definitely hadn't planned. About 40 minutes later, headlights appeared. A massive tow truck rolled slowly toward the lot and stopped beside me. Wade climbed out. Broad shoulders, heavy boots, bigger than I'd imagined. He glanced at the trailer and whistled. Nice setup. Then he nodded toward the signs. Mind if I document everything? Go ahead. He took pictures of the signs, the property stakes, the trailer, the license plate, every angle imaginable. Completely professional. No drama. No rusing. Just procedure. Then he walked over to the hitch and started preparing a rig. Watching a professional hook up something that size is strangely fascinating. Chains clinking, hydraulic arms moving, metal locking into place. Everything methodical. Like surgery. 20 minutes later, Wade climbed down and wiped his hands with a rag. Well, he said with a grin. You ready? I looked toward Garrett's house. No lights. No movement. No clue. Go ahead. Wade nodded, climbed into the cab, and fired up the engine. The hydraulics hummed. The trailer shifted. Slowly, almost gracefully, that giant white camper rose off the ground. And just like that, the trailer Garrett Hensley had treated like a permanent extension of his driveway wasn't sitting on my land anymore. It was rolling away into the darkness behind a tow truck. And I had no idea that the next morning, when Garrett discovered his precious trailer had vanished overnight, things were about to get a whole lot more interesting. By the time Wade's tow truck disappeared around the bend, the whole road was quiet again. Just wind, gravel, and those bright red signs standing there like they'd been waiting patiently for months. I remember standing beside my truck for another minute, hands in my pockets, thinking how strange it was that something that had annoyed me for nearly an entire summer had just been solved in less than an hour. No shouting, no threats, no drama, just paperwork and a phone call. Then I drove home, made myself a sandwich, watched a little baseball, and went to bed. I figured that was probably the end of it. Turns out, I was wrong. Saturday mornings in Pine Hollow are usually peaceful. Somebody's mowing their lawn too early, somebody else is heading to the lake with fishing rods, and old Mrs. Henderson's wind chimes are making enough noise for half the neighborhood. I was halfway through my second cup of coffee when I heard tires crunching into my driveway, hard enough to make me look out the window. Black pickup, Garrett, and judging by the way he slammed the door, he hadn't come over to borrow sugar. I stepped onto the porch just as he marched toward me. His face looked like he'd spent the last 30 minutes searching for something that absolutely should have been where he'd left it. Morning, I said. He ignored that completely. Where's my trailer? No hello. No small talk. Straight to the accusation. I leaned against the railing. You mean the one parked on my property? His jaw tightened. Yeah, that one. I nodded. Well, if it was on my property, it probably got towed. For a second, he just stared. Then he laughed. Not because he thought it was funny. It was the kind of laugh people make when reality refuses to cooperate with them. You're kidding. I pointed toward the road. Company numbers on the sign. He ran both hands through his hair and paced across the driveway. You actually had it towed? Yep. Come on, Ethan. I thought those signs were just for show. I couldn't help smiling. You mean warning signs? That only made him more irritated. You could have come talk to me again. And that's the moment I laughed. Not to be rude. Not because I was enjoying his misery. But because the irony was too perfect, Garrett, I did talk to you, remember? He stopped. When, the first time, I asked you to move it. His eyes shifted downward as the memory caught up with him. And then, the next weekend, I asked. It came right back. He shoved his hands in his pockets. That was temporary. Twice. He didn't answer. Instead, he sighed hard enough to fog a window. Do you have any idea how much this is going to cost me? Honestly, I said, probably a lot. He looked genuinely offended. All this over a little gravel. And there was again, the exact same sentence, the exact same thinking. I stepped off the porch and walked closer. Garrett, this stopped being about gravel a long time ago. It's about respect. It's about the fact that it's mine. He didn't say anything. The breeze moved through the trees, and somewhere down the road somebody started a lawnmower. Finally, he asked, where'd they take it? Ridgeway Recovery, out by Highway 19. He nodded and started walking back to his truck. Halfway there, he stopped and turned around one more time. You really went through all this trouble instead of letting me park there? I leaned against the porch post and smiled. You really went through all this trouble instead of widening your driveway? That one hit him. He shook his head, climbed back into the truck, and drove away. And for the next couple days, the whole thing became neighborhood gossip. Small towns are funny like that. News travels faster than Wi-Fi. My brother Scott called me laughing. Tell me you didn't actually have somebody's camper hauled away. Yep. Garrett's. Yep. He nearly choked laughing. Man, that's cold. But here's the funny part. By Monday evening, Garrett came back. And this time he wasn't angry. He just looked exhausted. I was trimming branches near the fence when he walked over. $820, he said. I looked up for the tow and storage. Ouch. He nodded. Yeah. I honestly expected another argument. But instead he just sighed. Guess I earned that one. And right there, something changed. Maybe it was pride finally running out of gas. Maybe reality had done what my words couldn't. But for the first time since this whole thing started, I saw something I hadn't seen before. Humility. Over the next few weeks, truckloads of gravel started showing up at his place. He rented a skid steer, widened the side of his driveway, moved some bushes, and by the end of October, his trailer fit perfectly beside his house. Problem solved. And after that, we never had another issue. In fact, something unexpected happened. One afternoon the following spring, I was fixing a fence post when Garrett walked over holding 2 cold beers. He handed me one and said, "You know, my wife still thinks you're terrifying." I laughed. Terrifying? I made one phone call. He grinned. Exactly. And we both laughed. Because time is a funny way of sanding down rough edges. Looking back now, I honestly think the whole thing could have turned ugly if pride had stayed in the driver's seat. But neither of us wanted a war. I just wanted the same respect everybody expects for their own property. And Garrett eventually figured out something a lot of people forget. Just because something looks unused doesn't mean it's available. Empty doesn't mean abandoned. Quiet doesn't mean nobody cares. And sometimes the loudest response in the world isn't yelling. Sometimes it's paperwork, patience, and one very expensive tow truck. Still, even after all these years, people around Pine Hollow don't completely agree about what happened. Some folks say I handled it perfectly. Others say maybe I should have warned Garrett one more time before making that call. And honestly, I still hear both sides. So now I'm curious what you think. If a neighbor repeatedly parked on land you owned after you'd already spoken to him once, would you have done the same thing? Would you have called the tow company? Or would you have given him one last chance? Let me know down in the comments, because I read every single one, and trust me, I have a feeling this one might divide people right down the middle.